Hello everybody and welcome back. We are working on the cockpit again. I hope you guys are having a phenomenal day because this is fun. So, I'm going to cover what I've done on the controller today, and hopefully you guys are going to see kind of what is really going into all this experimentation. So, when I started out with this Arduino Mega. This little guy will power the entire cockpit. It'll give me all the inputs and outputs that I need. It will have everything so that I can have this gigantic matrix that goes out. And that was the theory. So, when we started out, we built this little board. Nice, pretty simple circuitry, not too hard. Got a lot of holes so that I could basically do all the logic on this for my little grid. And that would have run the entire cockpit. It did test my circuit panel, or my fuel control panel, and all was jolly. Then I tried to actually get the fuel control panel to send out some kind of output. Joystick buttons, keyboard outputs, something I could map in game. That was where we hit the problem. This board is old, and it doesn't support the logic that you actually need to send those out over serial. So at that point there were two options. I can either buy a newer board which doesn't have all the inputs and outputs, or I can write my own firmware that will essentially take all of this data, send it to the computer side in a serial, and I can convert that to a keyboard. That would work, but it wasn't something that I wanted to play with at the moment. I would like to just download and use a joystick library and call that good. So, we went with option number one, and we bought an Arduino Leonardo. The Leonardo is a little smaller. It has 16 outputs, I believe, maybe 14. I think it's 14 outputs and 6 analog inputs. That's nowhere near what I need. I had to get creative, and we started using AND gates. I'm using these little guys. I need to solder on a whole bunch of AND gates and essentially run these spikes down and into the Arduino Leonardo. So, I'm going to cut to the work that I did on that, and you guys are going to be able to watch some of the compilation. It took probably in the order of about 3 hours to put 7 AND gates onto one of these little boards, but I will show you the beginning of that, and then we'll come back and cut to what actually happened with it. So, here goes, over to the soldering. We are going to turn these little boards into boards like this. So I need 2 of these. These are expanders for the primary logic gates. These are tiny little AND gates. These are 7408s. I need 7 of them per board, and I need 2 boards per cockpit. Those are all going to go on an Arduino Leonardo, but I have a couple of AND gates. Oh, and here's another box and another one. Yeah, so I've got a little bit of room to screw up. I hope I don't. These things take forever to solder. But I'm going to get started soldering, and you guys won't see a lot of it because I'm going to fast forward through it. But here we go. Okay, so after about 4 hours of soldering, this is what I have. That sucked to solder. So this was actually version 2. This was version 1, and the wires are way bigger. So I actually had to get some smaller wire, and yeah, these guys were massive wires. They were stepping all over each other. That's just with 3 on there, and well, the 4th one on the bottom is not quite connected, but that's just with 3 of them on there, and it was getting so difficult just to be running these little wires. So I bought smaller wires, and it worked a lot better. It still took a long time. This is probably, like I was saying, about 4 hours. These little guys, this is an output board, so this is channel 1, this is channel 2, this is channel 3, etc. This is an input board. It's got 6 inputs, and essentially we're going to wire the entire cockpit out of these boards. There's going to be 60 or so outputs, I think it was. A lot more than that. I have 60 outputs mapped. So this doesn't hold them all. There's going to be several of these boards. Then they're all going to go out to the cockpit. Whatever switches they have come all the way back and then be wired into this. So I can only have 6 switches or positions out of each one of these lines, and then they will come out into these 6. Then I will turn that lane off, turn the next lane on, power my next set of switches, read them in through this board, and that's the idea. Problem is, when I plugged this in and started testing, not all of my AND gates were working. So I had maybe 3 or 4 that just I couldn't get any readings on. There were 2, the connection just wasn't good enough in that. So somehow I have to debug that to figure out which wire didn't connect right. That is where I started thinking about making my own printed circuit board. So printed circuit boards are really complicated. Normally you see them in full-on manufacturers. Think your motherboard and your computer. Think just about everything electronic has a printed circuit board. This is a printed circuit board where they literally just print all the layers, attach the components on top, and that's your chip. Problem is, these are expensive. Like, to prototype one of these, I'm gonna be spending somewhere on the order of hundreds of dollars. Unless you're ordering thousands of them or more, these get very expensive very quickly. If you're ordering, I don't know, 1 million like Arduino does, these are probably $5 a board. Pretty cheap. But when you're doing one-off prototyping, they get super expensive really fast. So I decided to make my own. So I went into Eagle, made my own. It got really complicated. This little board with only 6 of these little guys became a nightmare. It became a gigantic mess. But I got some of it. So I'm gonna cut to the footage of me actually making and etching my own double-sided printed circuit board. It was kind of cool, a little sketchy because some of the chemicals I'm using are very, very toxic, but we'll talk through it and I'll let you guys know what I'm doing in the video. So here goes. So these are little tiny circuit board, essentially blanks. They've got copper on 2 sides and a non-conductive material in the middle, and the idea is that you will make a way that the copper will not be etched away, and you put it in an etch and it removes all the excess copper. So you start out with too much and you remove it. At this point, I'm just unwrapping the one board that's a pack of 25, so I plan on doing a lot of etching. That's kind of what the board looks like. It doesn't look phenomenal, but there's copper everywhere. So I grabbed a Scotch-Brite pad. One of the methods of essentially roughing up the copper surface was to take a Scotch-Brite pad and some of this goo off. It's essentially an acetone-based cleaner, kind of a solvent, and the idea is we need to get everything off of it. All of the fingerprints, grease, any kind of chemicals, even a little bit of oxidation. So we're using the Scotch-Brite pad just to scuff it up, to kind of dig in and get it so that we have a very good adhering surface. In the future, I'm probably not going to use Scotch-Brite. I've seen some other people use 600 grit sandpaper. I don't know if we want it perfectly smooth or really roughed up. So I'm going to try both methods in the future and see which one works out better, because the Scotch-Brite pad did not have the desired results that I was looking for. The goo off was great. I didn't have any of the toner transfer actually coming off, which means that it adhered very well and there was no grease or anything else on it. And at this point I'm wearing gloves so that none of the oils from my own skin will actually get on it and cause it to delaminate with the toner transfer later. Okay, so these are toner transfer paper that I have printed the PCB diagram on. So I figured I'd give you guys a quick little look at how I was getting this adhered, or getting it all lined up. We take a piece of tape, put it on there, put it on the light, get everything perfectly lined up, and then fold the tape over. So now that it's all lined up, we're feeding this through the laminator, which will transfer the toner via both pressure and heat, and it should adhere to the copper. This will make a negative of what we're actually trying to keep. So we want to put our traces on there and then etch away all of the excess copper. So this method was very difficult to actually have work. In the future, I'm going to drill a little hole and use that as my, well, 2 holes, and use those as my alignment pin. Essentially, I'm going to do this on only one side, drill the holes, then flip it over and align the other side and run that through. We laminated it, now we put it in some water that essentially dissolves the paper and makes it so that it slides right off. That leaves the toner behind and takes away the paper. So now we have essentially a perfect negative of where we want to have traces on the copper board. At this point, I'm just hoping they're all lined up on both sides, because the method that I had used to put them on there was not super confidence inspiring. At this point, I'm just inspecting it, looking to see how it actually turned out, which the holes actually turned out essentially perfect, which is nice. Now we're in my backyard. That's a combination of muriatic acid and hydrogen peroxide that I just put in there, or that I just put it in, and essentially that will etch the copper board. So it will create a couple of very, very dangerous chemicals, one of them being chlorine gas. So I'm doing this with a respirator, and I'm not sticking my head directly above it. So we just kind of watch at this point, and we wait for it to etch. So at this point, I flip it over, well, pull it out, take a look, and it's actually etched. You can see on both sides that there's copper on the backside. So this is a tub of baking soda and water that essentially neutralizes the acid. The idea is I'm actually rubbing the bottom with my finger, that kicks it up, and the combination is releasing a couple of bubbles, and essentially it's neutralizing that extremely powerful chemical. It's a pretty big tub of baking soda and water. Leaving that in there, rubbing it around, making sure that everything is completely in contact with it. Then we're going to head inside and give it a quick wash. So now we're going to give it a quick rinse just to get off all the baking soda and make sure that none of the residual chemicals are on it, and we're just going to make sure it's completely clean. So now we are back inside with some more of the goo off, and we are going to be removing the toner. So that was acting as a barrier between the acid and the copper so that it actually leaves the copper. So the part that's left behind are actually our traces. So at this point we'll be able to drill our holes, mount our pieces, and those will act as wires. And as you can see, that is where we are at this point. So the traces actually went through really well. They're lined up perfectly. All the holes are in just the right spot, but there's one glaring flaw in this little circuit board. And it's much easier to see when there's light behind it. So, there is our problem. Hopefully you guys can see that. But the traces, they're not very strong. Unfortunately, the etching solution that I used took away too much copper, and I'm not going to be able to get good electricity through these lines. So we're gonna have to do it again. And that's where we are right now. So this is going to be the best, most repeatable method that I can do. It's the quickest and easiest for things like etching a bunch of these at once. But I have to get the process right, and I've got to get it working. That's the hard part. So, I'm going to get these guys working in the next video, and we are going to put a whole bunch of holes in there, a lot of holes in there, mount components, and really get started building this thing. It's going to need a 3D printed box to hold all this stuff, so we might make that in the next episode, but we'll see. Probably still going to be in the prototyping phase of these guys, but hopefully at the end of next video, we will have a circuit board that works. It's taking a lot of iterations, which is kind of why it's taken so long to get all these videos out. These things take a huge amount of work to design the PCBs, to actually run everything. All the soldering's not too bad, but just in general, there's a huge amount of work that goes into making these parts. And hopefully you guys are enjoying following along as I make these parts. So, next video, we're going to be continuing on the circuit board. See you guys then.